Hi, I'm Marcel James. Welcome to the Marcel Vlog. This is the Mastering Edition, Part 1. I'm going to cover the history of how I got into mastering in this episode. Also, the influences, the tips that I got from different influencers, a lot of big name people, and I think some cool information. So I'm going to break these down into 3 parts. First, the background, my philosophy, the approach, what I learned from whom. There's some good stories in there, and there's some tips, some general tips in there as well. Then I'm going to cover some things that I don't do, 9 things that I don't do in the mastering process. That'll be the next episode. And then I'm going to do show breakdown with audio examples, the 10 steps of the room. So bear with me if you can. Listen to the history. I'm going to tell you hopefully some cool stuff, and then get on to the other videos as I go. The first thing I want to tell you is how I got into mastering, and it paralleled the Antelope story. So far all my vlogs have been about Antelope. This one is no different in that sense, but it is more about this chapter of my story with Antelope, which is how I ended up with a mastering room. I was going around with the clocks to all kinds of studios. I mean, really anyone who would listen. And for 5, 6, 7 years, running around LA, New York, and even other places in the world, in Europe, and doing these demos and just walking in, connecting the clocks, disconnecting or turning them on, turning them off, and let people hear the difference for themselves. But for some reason, the mastering rooms intrigued me the most. And maybe it's because they had the best speakers, the best gear, the best acoustics, some of the best engineers, and they were fine-tuning things at very high resolutions. And that lent itself really well to the clocks. So I became intrigued by that, and when it came time to put a demo room together in LA, I thought, why don't I just kind of put a mastering room together, or at least get some mastering gear in there so people can hear it the way that I heard it in some of these mastering rooms. So I searched out some mastering speakers, or at least what I thought at that time were good mastering speakers, and different gear. Now the entire rig has evolved over 10 years. It's much different today than it was then, but essentially it came up with a nice sounding setup, and people would come in and say, oh, you have a mastering room. I'm like, well, it's kind of setting it up that way, but yeah, I'd like to have a mastering room. But it was more so as a demo room, and it did become a mastering room, sort of like really organically. The first project I worked on, because I was really into EDM music at the time, I was also DJing some gigs around LA and some internet sessions. And one of my friends had a bunch of hits in the EDM scene, and his name is Matt Surf. And it was Surf Matiska Jaron. They had a bunch of vocal tracks, but the tracks that were getting played tended to be the remixes of their originals. And so we were kind of discussing this one day, and I said, why don't we master one of your tracks here and see how it goes? So we mastered a song called Beggin' You. And Beggin' You became a hit song for them. It was remixed by Armin van Buuren, but the original track was on the video. It has over 2 million views. This back screen right here is my website. You can click through it, you can navigate through it and see different studio gear that I use today. You can click on the news section, and you can see some of the projects I've worked on and read up on those. And in the listen section, you'll see, among others, the Beggin' You video as soon as the page refreshes here, which is this one down here with Jaron singing on the back of a table, on her back on a table. You got to watch the video to get the whole picture of what's going on there. Why is she on a table? She's on an operating table in the studio, actually, where that was shot. But it's a very cool video. It got a lot of views. And bottom line is that track became the impetus to me mastering several hundred more EDM tracks over the years. And then that became TV commercials. I worked on a Fiat commercial, a Ford commercial, a Taco Bell commercial. If you remember the $5 box with the beatboxing, that was a track I mastered. Ford was an online commercial. It was a Glitch Mob song where they remixed and glitched up a Vivaldi track. And that was really cool. That was a launching of the Fiat 500. And then I did a song that was featured, I mastered a song that was featured in an Apple iPhone commercial. So some pretty cool commercial stuff as well. And then a bunch of rock and some country and R&B and pop and all kinds of different types of genres. And I meet an eclectic mix of people through my work. And occasionally people come in and say, hey, we master this. And I tend to work with the same people over and over again. So that's how it all started. But then it evolved, and it evolved over the years. As I kept visiting these rooms, I'd learn, I'd get little nuggets of information from different engineers. And one of them, the first one I'll mention, is Scott Cedillo, and he's an engineer at Bernie Grundman Mastering. And what the thing that Scott taught me was how they make decisions about clocks and converters. Ideally, they'll take a source and go out the converter and come back in, and there won't be a change. That would be their ideal, because then you're only going through the analog gear and you're only getting what they apply in the analog chain. But since they felt they could never really get that, and no matter how close it got, they had to make a decision. Well, is it better or is it worse? Because it's never going to be the same. So they would always go with better, because if you're going to have something change, have it change a little for the better. And they would take tracks and spread them around the studio, and they'd all vote on it, and that's how they made their choices. And they did choose the analog clocks over what they were using before, so they used them in all the studios. They use them in all the studios at Bernie Grundman. So I applied that concept to my analog gear as well. I decided that if it's good enough for digital, it's good enough for analog. And analog changes the sound. Every piece of gear you plug in changes the sound a little bit. And if it did something bad, or if it went backwards just going in at unity, I would just cut it off right there. I wouldn't do it. And so it had to sound good on its own. And then when I applied settings to it, things just got better. And that was a general rule. And I went through a lot of gear to come up with a few pieces that I have here that I use. And you'll see all of that in the 10 steps video when that comes out. Another influencer for me was Joe Gastwort. Joe's a very famous mastering engineer. He's worked with Yes, Tom Petty, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Grateful Dead, 311, and he's very old school and very analog. And he has great gear, great ears, and he's a really cool guy. And I actually bought my L2 from him because he wanted to get away from any kind of digital processing. I'm just going all analog, Marcel. So I'm like, all right, cool, I'll take that L2, and I've been using it ever since. The same one. So, but I asked him, I said, don't you care about getting things loud anymore? You just don't care. And he said, no, I still get things loud. I get things loud enough for the music that I work on, and I do it on analog gear. So I'm like, how'd you do that? Well, I just clip it. I hit it in a certain way. I find the sweet spot or that hot spot of every piece of gear, and I just kind of push it. I thought that was pretty cool and pretty interesting. So that's where I learned about what you can get by pushing it through the gear. I remembered that I used to have an analog console, and I'd turn up the inputs really hot, and everything would sort of glue together. So it's that kind of a concept of just clipping that analog gear really hot. And I don't mean clipping in the bad sense, but in really just hitting it really hot, saturating the gain structure of the gear. So that was a big thing that I learned from him. Another thing, he was telling me one day about picking up some BAE 1073s. I'm like, what do you need mic pre's for? He's like, no, I'm using it for line amplification because they have really good, musical line amplification. So I'm like, okay, well, I didn't really understand totally at first what he meant, but later I ended up with some BAEs, some 10DCs, but it's the same Carnell transformers, and it's really a similar sound. I could do a couple other things with those. I don't really compress with them, but I do use the link functions to sort of make things narrow and wide, and again, talk more about that later, but I mostly crank up the gain because I love that gain. I love how it hits the transformers on the way out. And so that's a trick I picked up from Joe as well. Another influencer was Doug Sachs, the late, great Doug Sachs. And Doug was, all of these guys so far that I'm naming are analog guys, and that's kind of the interesting tie-in there. Doug was no different. He used analog clocks. He wanted to check out a new converter at one point and said, I'll come over to your studio. I'd like to check it out anyway. So he came by, and we're sitting there, and we're kind of listening. He looks down, and he sees the wires, and he goes, is that alpha wire? And I said, yeah, I know you use that. And he said, yes, I do. He said, how did you find out about it? And I said, well, it was through Stephen Hazelton. And he just cracked a big smile and said, Steve. And Stephen used to be his tech for years and has since sort of retired, but he has a few select clients. And one of them is my friend David Ives, another big influencer I'll talk about in a minute. And Stephen actually hipped me to these cables via David. But the initial place that came from was the mastering lab, Doug Sachs's room, where they compared all kinds of wire, thousands of feet of wire versus point-to-point soldering. And they chose through the end of this process that the solid core copper had the best sound. It was the closest thing to point-to-point soldering. So, and it really has this fast, immediate sound to it. I'm not here to sell you cables. You got to make them yourself anyway. But it was an interesting story about Doug. The other thing that Doug taught me was how to use your room. Because I remember he backed up in the room and said, here's your bass, here's your subwave, and here's your bass wave right here. And I backed up and I'm like, yeah, I hear that. And I'd heard it a lot. But he said, yeah, you need to back up when you're listening to the track. He said, I know you get more resolution up closer where you're sitting, but you need to come back here and listen so you hear that full low end. So he taught me to move around the room and use the room and find that sweet spot in the room. And since then, I sit further back, and I also roll back sometimes to check tracks out from further back in the room. So that was another cool tip from Doug Sachs. David Ives, who has a room that you probably haven't heard of, but he works with all kinds of people you have heard of. And he works in a place in Beverly Hills called 101 Mastering. And I mean, he's doing work with Dave Grohl right now. He worked with the engineers who worked with Beck for years. And he has a lot of guys like Daryl Thorpe and Brian Vibberts. Daryl actually works out of that facility with Brian, or that room. They have a couple spaces there, a couple rooms. And so it's just an amazing sounding room where audio is just revealed. And that's where I learned about Lipinski speakers. It's where I learned about passive monitor controllers and how advantageous they could be. We did tons of Antelope testing there over the years at David's room when Antelope gear would come out. I learned about Sontec EQs from David. I learned about, and actually bought my Sontec. This was a second Sontec mastering EQ that he had and decided to sell me one day. And so I got all this great gear from some of my mentors, which is cool. And he also taught me about the center and how important it is, at least his approach, and I've definitely adopted or tried to adopt that approach very much. We're keeping that solid core center. And that's something I'll talk more about a little bit later and give you some examples and show you some sound field metering and how that matters so much. And the other thing that he taught me about was brightness, in not the good sense, but a bad sense. And not talking about 10K, but really 5K, 6K, 3K, 4K, being too bright. And I'm saying you could take an EQ, a Sontec, and boost it 1 or 2 dBs at 3 or 4K, and it'll be nice and present. You can do that on certain other EQs and it'll get bright, or some converters are naturally bright sounding, that kind of thing. So always be on the lookout for too much phony bright. People are usually going to, at first listen, pick the brighter sound, but then it becomes fatiguing over time, and you stop listening to the rest of the sound. And it's better to have a nice core low end and mid range, and a top end that's open but not brittle, not bright, not harsh, not anything that'll tire you out, and that can be tricky. So keeping a lookout for that is very important. I actually have a passive monitor box built by Steve Hazelton, and he built 2 of them, one for me and one for Brian Vibberts, and I have to thank David Ives for setting that up as well, because I still use it to this day. It's very, very cool. So just sort of, I'll get more into the gear, but I don't want to make you wait only for the last episode. But there is there's also Goliath and a HD and a 10MX I love a lot here. There's a hardware limiter, the old one from Waves, the L2. The BAE I mentioned, there's a Summit compressor. And then I'll break down those more in the 10 steps, but I don't want to leave you hanging in the meantime. So that concludes this episode of the Marcel vlog. Stay tuned for the next episode when I cover the 9 things I avoid when mastering, and after that, the 10 steps in my mastering chain. Remember, if you would like for me to master your music, you can reach me at marceljamesmastering.com. Just go to the contact tab, fill out the form, and let me either send me a link to your music or let me know what questions you have about mastering. Thanks a lot for watching. See you next time.